Welcome to part A of the Introduction to Strategic Supplier Relationships. When we talk about strategic supplier relationships, say that a couple of times, it's kind of a tongue twister, we have to really start out with this idea of marketing channels. And I should tell you a little bit about myself. That's my area, marketing channels. I've written several books in the area, and right now I'm largely engaged in international marketing channels, is the area of focus of both research, executive education, and teaching for me. So how does it apply to strategic supplier relationships? Well, everything, in my view, falls under this large rubric or umbrella of marketing channels. What constitutes a marketing channel we'll get to in a minute. But if we think about the whole notion of channels of distribution, there are four kind of elements of channels that have everything to do with supplier relationships. You can't disconnect from these four elements of channels. The first one is the notion of interdependency. And interdependency is fairly obvious, but it's something that we have to understand. Interdependency means that between suppliers, manufacturers, intermediaries, and customers, intermediaries could be suppliers to the customer, retailers, distributors, etc. There's obviously a connectedness. There's an interdependency that governs that relationship. Second of all, there's a shared objective. The shared objective between suppliers, manufacturers, and all the way through the channel is to deliver the best value. And we'll talk about value space, a notion of a value chain management that will be kind of a common foundation of everything we talk about in supplier relationships. So we'll talk about that in the second part of this introduction. Third thing is it's a connected system. So if you take one of the links out of the system, you either have to go to an extramediary, that means an organization that's outside of the supply chain, or you have to figure out how you're going to reallocate resources to cover for that missing link. So if you take a link out of the chain, how are we going to cover the services or functions or values provided by that link? And in fact, that's one of the things that's happening in supply chain management with respect to making more lean operations and re-engineering. And finally, there's flexibility. There's market dynamics. The markets change. Okay. Where goods are manufactured is changed fundamentally almost across every industry. All you have to do is look at China, whether you look at the Yangtze River Delta or the Pearl River Delta province, and how they've really changed the way and movement of goods and services throughout the world. So what do we mean by this notion of marketing channels? I mean, it's a nice word to use, and it's an overused moniker for a lot of what we talk about. But the definition I'll use is the one that was pioneered by Pelton, and that's an array of exchange relationships that create customer value in the acquisition, consumption, and disposition of market offerings. Let me say it again. An array of exchange relationships. What do I mean by an array? Where there's a wide and diversified portfolio of types of exchange relationships, not only in terms of different role sets, but also in terms of the function and services provided within the exchange relationship. So the relationship you have in a direct between customer and internet provider, and you order your computer from Dell, and Dell doesn't start manufacturing until the order is placed, is very different than the paradigm that Compaq uses, where you go into a retailer like Best Buy, and that exchange relationship is quite different. We might go to another industry, like pharmaceutical industry, where that exchange relationship is one of the most convoluted. Think about it. You can't just walk in. You know you need an antibiotic because you don't feel well. You've had the same kind of symptoms that would lead to using an antibiotic before. Maybe you have a urinary tract infection. But what do you have to do? You have to go to a doctor, and that doctor has to authorize or write a prescription. Then, in this country, we take that prescription to a pharmaceutical retailer who actually fills the prescription, and then a decision is made between the physician and the pharmaceutical retailer, depending on whether she or he wrote dispenses written and a brand name, whether or not you'll get a generic. And by the way, we have a third-party provider that intercedes in that entire exchange relationship. So there are a lot of issues involved, especially in the healthcare industry. But in every case, in every exchange relationship, marketing channels are trying to create customer value, what we'll talk about with respect to value space. And I say it's in the acquisition, how we go about acquiring goods, how we go about using them in the system, and also retro logistics or disposition, getting rid of goods, and also the ones that go back into the channel. So they're kind of a de facto producer role, eventuating from the actual user of the product or service that's employed. Now, this notion of customer value we'll talk about in great depth when we talk about value space. But when we talk about supplier relationships, there are 4 dimensions of customer value that cannot be disengaged or detached from our notion of supplier relationships. One is the idea of contactual efficiency. Not contractual, but contactual efficiency. How we reduce transaction costs by reducing the number of contacts that are necessary to have the process consummation or completion. The second thing is routinization. To what extent are processes routinized? And I'll give you consumer examples of contactual efficiency. When we go to get milk, we don't want to have to go to Wisconsin and milk a cow and then process, whether you use 0.5%, or skim milk, or 1%, or whole milk. We don't want to go through those processes. We just want to be able to go to a retail outlet and have all the choices on one shelf. And in fact, it's kind of bizarre to people who visit from other countries and see the number of SKUs in a commodity-like product like milk. But even we don't just buy milk, and we don't just buy skim milk or soy milk or lactose intolerant, lactate type of milks. We also have brand affinities. So we may want Borden, or we may want Brahms, and there's so many outlets and so many brands, but that patronage comes through. The same thing happens in supplier-manufacturer relationships, that there are reputational advantages that underlie contactual efficiency, the efficiency that underlies contact. With routinization, obviously, when you go to McDonald's, you know that routine that everybody goes through, no matter where you are in the world. You can point to a picture, if you speak the country or not, and say, with Coke, and you get your burger, fries, and a Coke, except in some places in India where they don't sell meat products. But basically, the process is very routinized. There's a notion of assortment, and assortment means, obviously, selection. And when we come to manufacturers, that assortment's an important criteria. If you think about the automobile industry and the assortment of goods that go into every manufacturer of an automobile, how many suppliers do I want to use? Do I want to use consolidated supplying, or do I want to go to individual suppliers? And also that's governed by how much technology and intricacy is associated with a particular product or classification of product. And finally, we have minimizing uncertainty. How much risk are we willing to take with respect to supplier relationships? If you think about it, contactual efficiency, routinization, assortment, and minimizing uncertainty, we think about the CRAM. You can tell me to cram it, but it might be a mnemonic device to remember contactual efficiency, routinization, assortment, and a minimization of risk. Ultimately, when we talk about marketing channels, we're talking about the notion of place. And one of the major issues that we talk about in supplier-manufacturer or manufacturer-to-supplier relationships, or anywhere else in the supply chain, is how much control we want. Should we go direct? Should we use intermediaries? What extent do we have to have control over the entire process? And that's really changing as I talk to you today. We know that a lot of processes have undergone tremendous gestalt types of leaps of faith in terms of how we go about acquiring, consuming, and disposing of goods and services. Many of the functions that you talk about in industrial distribution, like accumulation, breaking bulk, sorting, assortment, all of these things are kind of value-added dimensions that we'll talk about in value space. But key issues that we have to consider from a relational nurture point of view is, what type of relationship do we want to have? Are we in it for the long term? Are we price driven? What's happening with the industry? So what kind of relationship do we want to have? Is it short term? Is it transactional? Is it relational, ongoing, long term? Do we want a whole channel product market commitment? Do we want a total system solution? Or basically, are we trying to fill a small void? And how much impact does it have overall on our manufacturing process or in the ensuing channel of distribution toward the end user? Another consideration is conflict. How much conflict is there likely to be, and how are we going to handle those conflicts? Do we have a mechanism in place to ameliorate any conflicts that may come up, okay, and ameliorate the relationship itself? Do we have common objectives between suppliers, the buyers and sellers, the suppliers and the manufacturers and the suppliers? And also the notion of something called a captain in the system. And we know captains exist everywhere in the supply chain. We may think of retailer and Walmart and its initiative with RFID having a fundamental change in what the expectations of both manufacturer and suppliers will be in the supply chain, especially by January 2005. Finally, where I want to end up here is to talk a little bit about the contractual versus non-contractual elements of exchange and marketing channels. But why talk about that with supplier relationships? Because all supplier relationships are marketing channels. All supplier relationships are essentially marketing channels. And we need to know how to manage those channels. Are they ones with high governance that are very contractually defined, or is there a great deal of flexibility and abstract terms of the agreement? Is there a shared commitment or not a shared commitment? Is there largely autonomous responsibility given with respect to that marketing channel? I know a lot of this seems fairly elementary, but I want to make sure that we all have the same footing. From here, we're going to go to the second part of the introduction, which is the idea of value space. And after that, we'll have 8 modules in the semester that'll talk about each one of these things in greater detail and how we go about effectively managing strategic supplier relationships. Now let me say this. Again and again, I'll refer back to this term of strategic supplier relationships because we know, based on the McKinsey study, that the majority relationships are tactical. So one of the things that I'll question and I'll ask you to challenge is, to what extent is this supplier relationship strategic or is it tactical? Thank you.